Hello, my name is Ken Nair, and I'm with Christ Quest Ministries, where we disciple men to become the kind of spiritual leaders who are living examples of the Christ. In this three-part series, I want to talk about a topic that many families struggle with. I've titled it, Mom and Dad Ask, Where Did We Go Wrong? Before we get started, let me clarify something. You'll notice as we proceed, I use the words the Christ instead of just Christ. That's because Christ is not Jesus' last name. Rather, it's his title. The word Christ comes from the Greek word Christos, meaning anointed, and is referring to the anointed one. It's the equivalent of the Hebrew word Mashiach or Messiah. That's why when I refer to Jesus, I use his title, the Christ. To be the Christ or Messiah is to be the anointed one of God. My goal is to honor him by using his title. Okay, here we go with the topic about Mom and Dad Ask. And I'm going to here because it's a situation that causes so much grief in so many homes. And it seems to have no solution, leaving too many parents facing agonizing grief, sorrow, and guilt. First, let's get this out of the way, as it's an idea that seems to be a bottom line problem maker. Somehow or other, parents have gotten the belief that they've got to be the perfect parents so their children will turn out right. That concept will drive you nuts because there's no such thing as a perfect parent. Living under that pressure will create an atmosphere of stress in the home. Okay, now we move on and take a peek into some situations being faced by some honest, committed to their children, self-sacrificing parents. These parents, after a life of sincerely caring for their families and purposefully providing a Christian home atmosphere, in grief report the following situations. I don't know what's come over our son. He's hanging around with some pretty corrupt kids, staying out late at night, getting into all kinds of trouble. Or, the guy our daughter's dating doesn't even believe in God. We've talked to her blue in the face about it, and she rejects everything we say. He treats her like trash, and she keeps going back for more. How about we just found out that our son has been drinking and using drugs for a long time. He knows we're against it. We've tried to reason with him, but he doesn't listen. He just gets angry and storms off. Or our daughter's getting into the vampire stuff. She doesn't talk with us, and when she comes home, she goes straight to her room where she listens to the loud blaring stuff she calls music. And we've started noticing scratches or cuts on her arms. Our son's quit going to church and has stopped praying or reading his Bible. Our daughter makes spiteful remarks about Christianity and is always debating with us about our perspectives and the Bible, and she doesn't stop. Maybe you're facing similar situations or know someone who is, but if it's happened to you, you've also wondered, where did it go wrong? I have actually heard some parents say it's as if Satan stolen our son or daughter and replaced him with a demon-possessed clone. Even though our situation may not be the same, have you noticed the same attitudes? As a Christian parent, you may be facing or already have faced the same type of dilemma. If so, that's why I'm addressing this. Let me offer the following situation as an example. This case is going to be generic, allowing it to be identified with a son or daughter. If this example seems more radical than your situation, keep this in mind. If you can gain an understanding about solving a radical situation, surely the same process would easily apply to lesser situations. Here's the scenario. This family attended church religiously. Now, let me clarify, attending church religiously is not a contributing factor to this situation. Their son accepted the Christ as his Savior at an early age and regularly attended church with his parents. They made sure that their son's Sunday school teacher were teaching the fundamentals of Christianity. This family practiced traditional accepted Christianity in their home. In other words, they did everything they believed Christian parents should do. Still, during their son's high school years, let's call our son Ben, or shortly after his graduation, these parents started noticing changes in Ben. Then he went off to college, about 5 hours away. That's when his changes really became noticeable, more exaggerated. Soon after Ben arrived at college, his parents watched him get into relationships with girls whose reputations seemed, at best, questionable. His contact with his parents became noticeably less frequent and very artificial as they tried to reason with him about his associations and the moral consequences of his behavior. A child's distancing themselves will be covered later in point number 1. As the school year was coming to an end, Ben's parents talked with Ben about removing him from that college and its negative atmosphere and influence. In an effort to thwart that, he promised that he'd come home during the summer to be with his family. Yeah, he did promise, but it was just to get him off his back. It wasn't long before they discovered he had no intentions of honoring his promise. Instead, he planned to stay on campus. I'll address this later in point 2. Ben offered multiple excuses for not coming home, but they too were all lies. Initially, he gave reasons like he could earn an extra credit by completing additional studies during the summer, adding that he needed to use the summer to practice at improving his talents at his chosen sport. Then too, because dorm life was so noisy and distracting to his studies, he needed to get an apartment during the summer, telling them if he came home over the summer break, only junkie housing would be available when he returned to college. The reasoning? That he needed to find and rent it at the better off-school season price. Of course, he found one and signed a lease, deciding he might as well live in it. Next, he needed to get a decent paying job to pay for the apartment, along with other expenses. But Mom and Dad suspected, and later it would be verified, the real reason for Ben's resistance to returning home? He was planning all along to spend the summer living in the apartment with his girlfriend. Ben's parents turned to me for help because I knew the family and had some rapport with Ben. They explained that Ben wouldn't discuss any of their concerns with him, so I agreed to talk with him. When I called and asked if we could talk, Ben suspected that his parents were probably behind my call, which ignited him to defensively start complaining that he was sick and tired of their arguing with his parents. They didn't listen to him, and he was done with their intimidation, manipulation, and trying to control him. I'll address being controlled later in point 3. He then began repeating all the same complaints he had towards his parents that they recite about him. After listening for about a half hour, I asked if he'd like to know the real reason he was facing all this relational turmoil. Because he'd been living with all this turmoil and confusion long enough, he answered with a questioning, "Yeah." I'm going to address learning to listen later in point 4. In order to help Ben capture what I wanted to tell him, I used the following illustration. Some time back, I was leading one of our California Christ Quest Institute classes. We'd been conducting discipleship classes for married couple students all over the states for years. Our goal is and always has been only that Christian husbands get discipled to the degree that they become literal illustrations of the Christ to their wives. Anyhow, a husband in this Christ Quest Institute class had been attending for about 3 months. Classes are usually conducted with the students sitting in a circle, and as I usually did in this particular class, I went around the circle asking the husbands, based on circumstances that took place in your life, what do you think God was teaching you through those events? After discussing their situation in depth, so that we could discover God's specific purposes in each situation, and then provide scriptural answers that apply to their situations, along with specific steps for actions that produce spiritual maturity. With 5 of the guys in the group, I came to the 6th husband. When I asked him what he believed God wanted to teach him during the last week, he replied, "I don't think I care what God may be teaching me, nor do I care about God." Let me remind you, those words were spoken by a man who said, and had been for years, a Christian husband. His wife was shocked and astounded, and you could literally hear a gasp come from the other students. The atmosphere was instantly transformed. It became extremely tense. With a smile on my face, I said, "That's fantastic." Almost with a snarl, he asked, "What's fantastic about that?" Later, the other students expressed they were glad he asked that question because they had the same question. The following language I'm going to use is to convey a point. Every time I've used it, people have said they identified with it. If it seems irreverent, please understand each word I use has been carefully chosen because it conveys a concept. Regardless, since I'm running a risk, let me apologize ahead of time if you're offended. So I told that student, "Here's why I believe your response is fantastic. As Christians, we are all members of various forms of our local Christian club. And each of us understands what it takes to be members in good standing in our Christian club. Being acceptable in our Christian club depends on learning and living by its particular philosophy and theology. We know what version of the Bible is acceptable. We've learned what the acceptable spiritual language is. We know the acceptable music and which songs are the acceptable songs. Then too, we can gain an even greater acceptance by supporting it with money or talents. It's not uncommon that children join the Christian club their parents were members of, or to the person or persons who introduced us to Christianity belong. I continued explaining why his statement about God was fantastic. You're at a place where you have a decision to make, and there are 3 options to choose from. Number 1, I'm out of here. I'm sick and tired of playing the stinking Christian club game, and I'm not going to do it anymore. Number 2, you can conclude, whatever, and decide to kick into neutral and just stay where you are, continuing to play the Christian club game. Number 3, you could decide, I'm sick and tired of playing the Christian club game. So I've decided I want my own personal relationship with God. As I had hoped, Ben identified and exclaimed, "Christian club, that's an exact description of where I am." I continued, adding, even though this husband continued showing up in class each week, I didn't engage him, since he'd never said he changed his thinking. However, about 4 weeks later, as I was going around the room, he raised his hand. Acknowledging him, he said, "I've made a decision." I responded, "Good, what's your decision?" He declared, "I'm sick and tired of playing the Christian club game. I've decided I want my own personal relationship with God." As a side note, quite frankly, God's intentions are to bring each of us to the end of ourselves. At some point, we must all make or have already made this same decision. Facing this decision is, as earlier stated, an excellent place to find oneself. In response to his decision, the whole class inwardly, some outwardly, rejoiced at his decision. They also learned through observation, there's no need to panic when they hear those kinds of hostile, rejecting statements about God. Knowing God's ways, we should feel secure, comfortable, and able to remain calm if we recognize what God's doing in each situation. In this particular situation, God was bringing this student to a place where he would see the need to quit playing the Christian game. and make a decision, but it had to be his decision. His decision to gain the kind of spiritual maturity that goes far beyond the simple membership in his Christian club, including developing the kind of spiritual maturity that enables him to have a spirit-to-spirit relationship with God. That'll give him a knowledge where he'll experience the joy of having answers for these opportunities that come up in his life. The conversations between this husband and I covered a wide range of topics that pertained to membership in the Christian club. The exciting thing is this: bringing up the Christian club membership illustration opened a brand new door of spirit-to-spirit conversations for him. It enabled that husband to consider what kind of relationship he wanted with God. He recognized what he needed to do, discovered who God was to him. And that discovery opened the door to also talking about the need to discover if he was willing to let the Christ be Lord of his life. Honestly, I think everyone needs to make those same discoveries. But it needs to be each person's own decision. Nobody can make it for them. Upon sharing the discussion between Ben and me with his mom and dad, they reflected, but Ben said he had already his own relationship with God. He wouldn't hang around with the wrong crowd. He read his Bible regularly without us reminding him. He didn't even date. Their statement was believable. I wasn't doubting that Ben had, as a child, accepted the Christ as his Savior. But we were dealing with something different here. I explained that there was a difference between accepting the Christ as one's Savior and then adding to that, letting the Christ be Lord of one's life. That occurrence is the product of being discipled by someone who knows what that is. I'll address this later in point 5. It's surprising to see how many Christians don't seem to recognize or understand the difference between accepting the Christ as Savior and him becoming their Lord. Being unable to recognize Ben's struggles was the result of his parents not recognizing his or their human spirits. Too many parents' Christianity is based upon being members in good standing with their own Christian club. They've not been faced with the concept of lordship, so they haven't known they were required to make a decision about letting the Christ be Lord of their lives. The following factors lead me to believe that what I just stated is the case. Let's say a child has indeed accepted the Christ as his personal Savior. Then he becomes a young adult and finds himself entering into a whole new world of all kinds of things to consider. This child's world is being expanded way past Christian club membership. Life is now bringing him into contact with people who will mock his beliefs and lifestyle. This is something he's not been taught to contend with, so he's totally unprepared to deal with it. This young believer has his beliefs challenged, and the challenge puts him in a position where he needs to decide, is he going to remain an acceptable member of the Christian club or yield so he can become acceptable to his new non-Christian world? If, however, he becomes accustomed to it because he's yielded to the temptations of this non-Christian world and he's found enough pleasure in it that he doesn't want to give up those pleasures. He's also discovered that when he's around Christian club people, he can act like them and they won't even know he's fooling them. His conscience might bother him some at first because of the double standards he's keeping. He may even struggle over lying to his Christian club members. And quite possibly, even though he doesn't know it, he's actually faced with the bottom line question: who is God in my life? And how much am I willing to let him impact my life now? Then as a young adult, because his lifestyle is showing it's consistent with non-believers, his parents try to rationalize with him about his conduct. His parents try to influence his life's direction. That turned into debates and arguments. However, the real problem is not with his friends, nor with the direction in which his life is headed. The real problem is centered upon his need to make this decision. Will he accept the Christ as his Lord as well as his Savior? Remember, even though my illustration about a guy, it's also applicable to a woman. Here's yet another insight. Parents who have become bitter, hostile, argumentative, and controlling towards their young adult are demonstrating that they're not familiar with and are ill-equipped to deal with this type of situation. I believe the reason might be that the parents themselves have not made the same decisions their young adult is facing the need for. That of making the Christ their Lord also. May I ask you to consider this? How does a parent who received the Christ as their Savior, like their child has, and yet also like their child, has never faced the decision of making Christ Lord of their life, lead their child in making that decision? Those parents are facing the same struggle in their heart, their spirit, that their child's facing. Then, not having Jesus as Lord, neither do they have answers for any spiritual problems. Because that's true, how would parents be able to provide spiritual directions with the proper spiritual answers to their child's spiritual needs? How would a father or mother be able to illustrate the kind of Christ-like example, if Jesus isn't Lord of their lives, that would cause their child to see what spiritual maturity and spiritual answers even look like? Instead, since Jesus isn't their Lord, their child won't see a lifestyle that illustrates they can have confidence in their parents' spiritual maturity, since they haven't modeled any kind of answers for life that was a witness to their child that they were able to master life. May I propose that a parent who's not wrestled with the need for Jesus as Lord will not know how to help their child have victory over that same dilemma. I'm going to cover much more thoroughly the difference between the Christ as Savior and Lord later. This is a good place to introduce another consideration. How does a parent know if their child simply went through the motions of accepting the Christ as their Savior? Or if their child accepted the Christ because they knew their parents had expectations of them to do so? Every child knows what their parents' expectations are of them, along with the expectations of their parents' particular Christian club. So, in order to gain their parents as well as the Christian club members' acceptance, they do whatever is necessary to gain that approval. Parents need to be certain that their child wants to accept Jesus as their Savior and Lord, because they watch their dad illustrate the Christ and want the same kind of relationship with God and their wife, their parents have. That longing is in their child's heart. It must be a child's own quest for salvation, though. Again, a parent must be certain that their son or daughter is not simply yielding to the pressure of their parents' expectations. Back to Ben. Talking to Ben's dad about his son living in the adult world, being faced with adult decisions, I brought up 1 Corinthians 13:11 in the Amplified Version. It reads, "When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought as a child. I reasoned like a child. Now that I have become a man, I'm done with childish ways and put them aside." May I suggest that the Bible, being a spiritual document, is pointing out the need to leave behind our childish, spiritually immature thoughts, and reasonings, and prove we're a spiritually mature man through our talk, thoughts, and reasonings. Next week, we're going to continue helping Ben's mother and father solve the problem of where we go wrong. It'll be part 2 of this series. Thank you for joining me here in part 1. If you have friends who are struggling with parent-child relationships, or want to know what's involved in making Jesus Lord, maybe you could share this with them. Then too, maybe the Lord might prompt you to consider blessing Christ Quest Ministries with a contribution. Till next time, this is Ken Nair, signing off.